7:14 a.m., March 3rd, 2026. Boise, Idaho. 14 FBI agents and 6 U.S. Marshals moved through the parking lot of a downtown hotel conference center in 2 unmarked columns. Civilian clothing. No visible badges. No marked vehicles nearby. From any window above the parking level, it looked like nothing at all. Estimated missing funds, $4. 3 million. 21 years on the run. The man they were looking for was inside. He stood at the front of a private dining room, welcoming donors to a breakfast event for the non-profit he had built over 19 years. Well-dressed, well-liked, completely unknown to anyone in that room as a federal fugitive. He had a prepared speech, index cards, a projected slideshow showing program metrics and employment placement numbers. He had no idea the parking lot behind him was filling with federal agents. The agents reached the main entrance at 7:16 a.m. 2 marshals took the service corridor. A 3rd team held the parking exit. Radio check confirmed all positions. The lobby was clear. At 7:18 a.m., the doors opened. The case that brought those agents to Boise did not start in Boise. It started in the high desert of northern Arizona in the summer of 2005, when a religious compound dissolved so quickly that neighbors didn't notice it was gone until the gates had been padlocked for 2 weeks. By then, the man who had controlled every dollar flowing through that compound was already somewhere else. The federal warrant issued in his name would sit dormant for more than 2 decades before a single IRS audit changed everything. This is that story. To understand what happened in that conference room in March 2026, you have to go back to the summer of 2003. That was when a fundamentalist religious sect called the Covenant Path Assembly established a compound on 46 acres of high desert land outside Flagstaff, Arizona. No street address on public record, registered to a land trust with a post office box in Coconino County. The assembly had roughly 80 members at its peak, most of whom lived on the property full-time, contributed their income to the collective, and had limited contact with the outside world. The compound was austere by design. A central meeting hall. Several rows of single-story residential structures built from cinder block and prefabricated panels. A communal kitchen serving 2 meals a day. A water storage system fed by a private well. Members did not own personal vehicles. Mail was collected by a single designated elder who made weekly trips into town. The isolation was not incidental. It was structural, built into the community's theology and its daily routines alike. The appointed treasurer of the Covenant Path Assembly was a man known to members as Brother Matthias. Within the sect's internal hierarchy, he held a position second only to the group's founding elder. He managed all financial accounts. He held signing authority over 4 separate church-registered LLCs incorporated in Arizona and Nevada. He controlled land title records, charitable donation receipts, and the banking relationships the organization maintained with 2 regional credit unions and 1 national bank. His given name was Gerald Allen Franco. What federal investigators would later establish is that Gerald Franco had no verifiable social security number prior to his appearance inside the Assembly's organizational structure. No prior address matched to his name in any state database. No employment records. No family members who could be located through standard search methods. He arrived, in bureaucratic terms, almost fully formed. A man with a signature, a title, and access to millions of dollars, but almost no traceable past. In July 2005, the Covenant Path Assembly collapsed. Former members used the word overnight when they later described it to investigators. The compound's founding elder suffered a medical emergency and was transported to a hospital in Flagstaff. Within 2 weeks, the leadership structure had fractured and members began leaving in groups of 4 and 5. By early August 2005, the property was vacant. Gerald Franco was gone. 2 former members, a married couple who had spent 4 years inside the assembly, filed federal fraud complaints in September 2005. They alleged that Franco had, over roughly 18 months, transferred funds from the Assembly's accounts into a network of shell LLCs with no legitimate operational purpose. Their estimate? $4. 3 million, accumulated through member tithing, charitable donations, land sales, and a series of agricultural grants the Assembly had applied for through a state-level program for rural religious communities. Those 2 former members, identified in court documents only as complainants, had left the compound in late July 2005 with almost nothing. A single vehicle, a small amount of cash from a family inheritance predating their time in the assembly, and the knowledge that years of contributed earnings had disappeared along with the man who had managed them. They drove directly to a relative's home in Phoenix. Within 6 weeks, they had hired an attorney and filed their complaint with the FBI. The FBI opened a case out of the Phoenix field office. Agents interviewed 12 former members over 4 months. They pulled the banking records. The picture that emerged was systematic and, mechanically, not especially complicated. The Covenant Path Assembly had operated 4 LLCs, 2 in Arizona, 2 in Nevada. The Nevada entities had been registered with nominee officers, names attached to addresses that turned out to be mail drop services. The Arizona LLCs were registered to Franco directly, under a name variation that differed slightly from the name used in the Assembly's internal records. The accounts associated with those entities had received wire transfers from the Assembly's primary accounts in increments carefully kept below $10,000, a pattern investigators recognized immediately. The structuring alone was a federal offense. But the deeper problem was Franco himself. The FBI could not find him. No social security number on record. The driver's license he had presented to the credit unions when establishing accounts had been issued in New Mexico in 1998 under a name that matched no birth record. The address on that license was a property demolished 3 years before the license was issued. 2 fingerprints lifted from the Assembly's administrative office, a partial from a filing cabinet, a second from a door frame, were run through every available database. No match. Agents canvassed the Flagstaff area. They spoke to the bank manager who had processed account openings. They interviewed the credit union representative who had personally met with Franco at least 3 times. The descriptions were consistent. A man in his mid-40s, dark hair going grey at the temples, quiet, precise. He had never seemed nervous. He had never seemed rushed. He always had the right documents, presented in the right order, with the right signatures. By early 2008, the case had gone cold. The file was closed for active investigation. The warrant, issued in 2005 under the name Gerald Allen Franco, with aliases attached, was entered into the national system. And there it remained. Here's what nobody expected. The thing that eventually broke the case open wasn't a tip, a new witness, or a database match. It was a non-profit filing in Boise, Idaho, reviewed by a mid-level IRS examiner during a routine audit cycle in January 2026. The non-profit was called the Vocational Pathways Institute, incorporated in Idaho in 2007. Stated mission: vocational training and employment placement for at-risk youth in the Treasure Valley region. By 2026, it had an annual budget of approximately $2, $8 million, a staff of 11, and a solid record with the state's Department of Labor. It had received federal workforce development grants through 2 separate program cycles. Its board included 2 retired school administrators, a local attorney, and, as chairman, a man named Robert Dale Whitmore. Robert Dale Whitmore had served 1 term on the Boise School Board, had been appointed to a state advisory panel on rural education, and had remarried in 2009. He had lived in the Boise area since 2006. By every visible measure, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a quiet civic presence with a long record of community involvement and no criminal history in any Idaho database. The IRS examiner who flagged the Vocational Pathways Institute in January 2026 was not looking for a fugitive. She was reviewing the organization's tax-exempt status renewal, which required examination of founding documents going back to the original application. What she found was a tax ID number in those documents that had been issued, according to IRS internal records, to an entity that had never completed its registration process. The number existed in the system but had been abandoned during the application process by a different organization years earlier. It had somehow been reused. That was the flag. A FinCEN referral was generated. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network ran a standard asset trace on the Vocational Pathways Institute. What came back within 72 hours was not standard. The Institute's primary real property asset, a training facility on a parcel of land in Ada County, traced back through 3 intermediate shell LLCs to a land purchase completed in June 2006. The purchasing entity in that 2006 transaction was one of the 2 Nevada LLCs that FBI agents had identified in 2005 as part of the Covenant Path Assembly's shell structure. The LLC had been technically dissolved in Nevada in 2004, before the purchase, but the dissolution had been improperly recorded, leaving the entity in a legal grey zone that allowed the transaction to proceed. The land had been purchased for $340,000. Cash equivalent. Wire transfer from an account in a smaller regional bank in Utah. A FinCEN analyst flagged the case to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Washington. An analyst there ran the underlying entity structure against existing open warrant databases. The Covenant Path Assembly case came up within 40 minutes. The Phoenix field office was contacted. The original case agent had retired in 2019. A supervisor pulled the file. 3 months of investigative work followed. The FBI's Boise field office was brought in during the second week. Agents established a secondary watch on the Vocational Pathways Institute without making contact with any staff or board members. A subpoena for Idaho DMV records for Robert Dale Whitmore was processed through the federal court in Boise in late January 2026. The records came back within 4 days. The 2019 driver's license renewal for Robert Dale Whitmore had required a biometric update under Idaho's Real ID compliance procedures. That update had generated a facial scan and a fingerprint record. The fingerprints had been entered into the state system, but had never been run against federal databases at the time. The FBI's Forensic Document Unit ran the 2019 fingerprint record against the partial prints lifted from the Flagstaff compound in 2005. The match came back positive. Not probable. Not partial. A full confirmation on the partial from the filing cabinet. Gerald Allen Franco and Robert Dale Whitmore were the same person. Investigators spent 10 days building out the corroborating record before any arrest planning began. A forensic accountant attached to the Boise field office mapped every financial transaction visible in Vocational Pathways Institute records going back to 2007, cross-referencing against the known shell LLC structure from the Arizona case. The analysis identified 7 distinct financial pathways connecting the Institute's founding assets to accounts that had received funds from the Covenant Path Assembly before it dissolved. None of those connections were visible at the surface level. All of them were documented. I spent time going through the forensic summary in this case, and one detail kept pulling at me. The fingerprint that identified Franco had been sitting in an Idaho state database for 7 years, never cross-referenced. The system existed. The data existed. They just hadn't been connected. A decision was made at the FBI's Washington level to proceed immediately with arrest rather than extend the surveillance period. The 2005 warrant was still legally operative. The statute of limitations on wire fraud charges does not run in cases where the subject has been continuously concealing identity. Every year Franco had spent in Boise as Robert Dale Whitmore was a year the clock had not moved. The FBI and U.S. Marshals Service began joint planning for the arrest operation in mid-February 2026. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Franco had, in a narrow legal sense, done almost everything right for 19 years. He had not re-established contact with any former assembly members. He had not used the Franco name in any documented context after 2005. He had not traveled internationally. He had not accessed the offshore accounts that investigators believed he had used to move a portion of the $4, $3 million in the immediate aftermath of the compound's collapse. He had built a life that, from the outside, was entirely clean. What undid him was paperwork. Specifically, the reuse of an abandoned tax ID number on a non-profit filing in 2007, an error that sat dormant for nearly 2 decades before a routine IRS audit cycle surfaced it. This is the part worth sitting with. Franco's mistake wasn't greed, wasn't a public profile, wasn't contact with former associates. It was a single administrative shortcut taken at the beginning of his new life in Idaho. One number entered incorrectly in one document. That document was never examined until January 2026. When it was, the entire structure he had built began to unravel in less than 4 months. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The IRS and FinCEN systems that flagged this case in 2026 existed in essentially the same form, or a functionally comparable form, since at least 2012. The cross-referencing capability that connected the Vocational Pathways Institute to the Nevada LLC to the Flagstaff case was not new technology. It was existing infrastructure used in a routine way. Franco wasn't caught because of some investigative breakthrough. He was caught because, for the first time in 19 years, the right document was looked at by the right person running the right automated check. Before 2026, no one had looked. That's a systems failure. Not a dramatic one, but a real one. On the evening of February 27th, 2026, FBI and Marshals Service personnel conducted a final pre-operation surveillance pass of the conference center where the Vocational Pathways Institute had scheduled its annual donor breakfast for March 3rd. The event had been on the nonprofit's public calendar since November. Franco, as Whitmore, was listed as the keynote speaker. The operational plan called for a low-visibility arrest during the event rather than a pre-dawn residence entry. The reasoning was documented. A residence entry carried risk of evidence destruction. An arrest at a public event with witnesses present, in a controlled space with multiple exits covered, reduced that risk. It also reduced the possibility of a flight attempt. What would you have done at 7 a.m. in that conference room, serving the warrant to a man who, to everyone around him, had spent 19 years building something real? The operational team numbered 20, 14 FBI agents from the Boise field office, 6 marshals. 2 additional agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had flown in from Washington the previous day. A plainclothes agent had attended the donor breakfast the previous year under a business cover identity to assess the layout of the conference space. Her notes from that visit: the sight lines from the main doors to the podium, the secondary exit near the kitchen corridor, the location of the hotel's internal security station, were incorporated into the final operational briefing. One obstacle emerged in the final planning stage: the hotel's service corridor, which the marshals had intended to use to cover the rear exit, had been partially closed for a scheduled maintenance project. The coverage grid had to be reconfigured in the 48 hours before the operation, moving the rear blocking position to the parking structure adjacent to the building. It was a workable adjustment, but it required repositioning 2 vehicles and re-coordinating radio frequencies with a different set of access points. The operation proceeded as planned on the morning of March 3rd. At 7:14 a.m., agents moved into position in the parking lot. At 7:16 a.m., the perimeter was established. At 7:18 a.m., FBI Special Agent Renee Caldwell and 2 colleagues entered the conference room through the main doors. Franco was mid-sentence. He was describing the Institute's upcoming job placement program to approximately 35 people seated at round tables. Several donors had coffee cups in hand. A projector showed a slide with the Institute's annual metrics. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to early mornings and people who believe they are among friends. Agent Caldwell crossed the room in under 10 seconds. She identified herself. She stated his name, both of them: Gerald Allen Franco, Robert Dale Whitmore. She told him he was under arrest on a federal warrant issued in 2005. He did not run. He did not speak. He set down the index cards he had been reading from. He placed both hands on the edge of the podium. He was handcuffed without incident in front of 35 people who had contributed money to the organization he had built and who had, until that moment, never heard the name Gerald Franco in their lives. He was transported to the Ada County facility and processed, transferred to federal custody the same afternoon. His initial appearance was held before a federal magistrate in Boise on March 4th, 2026, held without bail. The prosecution cited flight risk, 21 years of successful concealment as the primary basis. Federal charges included wire fraud, money laundering, structuring of financial transactions, and interstate transportation of fraudulently obtained funds. The indictment filed by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Idaho in March 2026 listed 6 counts across those categories. The sentencing guidelines range, based on the financial figures involved and the duration of the scheme, was calculated at between 11 and 17 years under federal sentencing parameters. One detail that stayed with me after reading through the case materials: the Vocational Pathways Institute had, over 19 years, placed more than 800 people in employment. It had received legitimate federal grants for legitimate work. The staff who showed up on March 4th did so not knowing whether the organization they worked for would survive the week. By late March, the Idaho Attorney General's office had announced it was working with the board to ensure continuity of operations for program participants. The Institute's assets, the training facility, equipment, grant funds, were subject to civil forfeiture proceedings as potentially derived from fraud proceeds. Whether any of those assets would ultimately be returned to the victims of the original Covenant Path Assembly fraud was, as of the filing of charges, unresolved. What do you think? Does 19 years of legitimate community work change anything about what justice looks like here? Or does the original fraud stand alone regardless of what came after? The financial recovery picture was incomplete. Of the $4, $3 million that prosecutors alleged Franco had diverted from the Assembly's accounts, approximately $1. $1 million was potentially traceable through the Idaho real property and the nonprofit's founding assets. The remaining $3, $2 million had not been located. Investigators believed a portion had been moved through foreign accounts in the immediate months after the compound dissolved, before Franco established himself in Idaho. Those accounts, if they still existed, had not been identified. The 2 former members who had filed the original fraud complaints in 2005 were both located by FBI victim advocates in March 2026. After 21 years, the case they had initiated was proceeding to prosecution. Comment: have you ever heard of a case where a fugitive stayed hidden this long through paperwork alone? No fake passport, no overseas relocation, just a different name in the same country? Drop it below. We read everything. The Covenant Path Assembly's former property outside Flagstaff had changed hands 3 times since 2005. By 2026, it was a working cattle operation. The land trust that had originally held title had been dissolved by court order in 2009 following a separate civil proceeding brought by former members. None of the settlement funds from that proceeding had ever been connected to Franco's whereabouts. 42 other former members of the Assembly had been interviewed by investigators at various points between 2005 and 2008. None had maintained contact with Franco after the compound dissolved. Several reported that they had not known his real name while living on the property. He had been Brother Matthias. That was all. On April 7th, 2026, Gerald Allen Franco entered a not guilty plea in federal court in Boise. Trial was scheduled for the fall of 2026. His defense attorneys had filed a preliminary motion challenging the chain of custody on the 2005 fingerprint evidence and the validity of the original warrant given the passage of time. That motion had not yet been ruled upon as of this report. The $3, $2 million not yet accounted for remains unrecovered. The original victims of the Covenant Path Assembly fraud are, as of 2026, in their 50s and 60s. They have waited more than 2 decades for this case to move. Whether the prosecution will result in restitution, and whether there are funds left to restore, is a question that trial will not necessarily answer. What the case does answer is this: a federal warrant has no expiration. The system that issues it is not required to find you quickly. It is only required to find you eventually. For 21 years, Gerald Franco operated in plain sight. He served on a school board. He ran a non-profit. He attended donor breakfasts. He relied on the assumption that a cold case stays cold. The IRS has a standard audit cycle. And sometimes, a routine review finds something that wasn't routine at all. If this channel covers cases like this one, cold warrants, dormant files, and the investigations that eventually close them, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Cases with 20-year gaps don't end the way you expect them to. Neither do the ones we're covering next. The warrant was served. The money is still missing. And somewhere in that gap is the part of this story that trial may never fully explain.